Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Amp Up Your Content Strategy and Campaigns with Auditory Storytelling. My name is Sal Losoro. I'm publisher here at Demand Gen Report, and I'll be your moderator for today's presentation. I encourage all attendees to get social with us during and after today's presentation. Please follow along and share your thoughts on feedback on Twitter using the hashtag COSeries. You can also connect with us on Twitter using the @DG_report handle, or reach out to me or our presenters directly on the handles listed on this slide. We're also hosting a special sweepstakes throughout this week-long webinar series where attendees can win a free ticket to our annual B2B Marketing Exchange, which will take place in Scottsdale, Arizona in February 2019. If you are registered for a COS webinar, which obviously you have done, you'll automatically be entered for a chance to win. And if you attend any live sessions, you'll receive a second entry. We'll be announcing winners at the end of each day of the series, so stay tuned. For those of you who may be new to the Demand Gen Report, you don't know what you're missing. We are an online media company publishing daily news, a weekly newsletter, special reports, original research, and a rich menu of additional resources. If you haven't done so already, please join me and more than 50,000 of your B2B marketing peers and subscribe to our weekly newsletter at demandgenreport.com. For today's presentation, we're using the On24 platform, and during the presentation, you can access all the information you need from the platform toolbar. We encourage you to ask our presenter questions, and to do so, simply click on the Q&A widget at the top right corner of the screen. Today's presentation is slated to run about 25 to 30 minutes, so we'll see how that goes, and then we'll have time set aside for Q&A following the session. You can submit questions using the Q&A widget at any time. For those who are wondering, the session is being recorded, and all attendees will receive an archived link to the presentation to go back and review or share with your colleagues. In addition to joining the conversation online and by submitting your questions, we also encourage you to let us know how we're doing. In an effort to constantly improve the level of value we provide our audience members, we've put together a very brief survey that will automatically launch once this webinar session ends. If you're one of those impatient types and rather not wait till the end, you can also pull up, complete, and submit the survey at any time during this webinar by clicking on the survey icon circled here at the bottom of your screen. Either way, we'd really appreciate your feedback. It will help us continue to improve the content we provide you. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce two of our featured speakers from our good friends at Content for Demand, Dana Harder and Steve Voith. Folks, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Sal. So hi, everyone. Happy to be here today. My name is Steve Voith, and I'm the Director of Marketing and Demand Gen for Content for Demand. My background is in B2B marketing. I've been doing content marketing and corporate communication for a long time now. And as a way to kind of tie in the theme and subject of today's webinar, we thought Dana and I would share our favorite podcasts. So on the outside of professional side, my favorite one is This American Life from NPR. I'm actually located here in Chicago, so WBZE Chicago and Ira Glass are it's become even more important in my life. They tell awesome stories from people all over the United States. And then on the marketing side of things, I actually really like Marketing Profs. They have a great podcast series called Marketing Smarts. Dana, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'd love to. Hi, I'm Dana Harder. I'm the Vice President of Strategy here at Content for Demand. I've been with Content for Demand about 8 years, and every day I get to help amazing marketers like yourself put together content marketing strategies and account-based strategies and influencer strategies, and love working with marketers on a day-to-day basis. My favorite podcast, I'm a little bit of a self-help junkie, so I love Tim Ferriss's podcast, and he interviews a lot of great people just on a variety of topics in life. And I also really like Oprah's, and she also interviews a lot of amazing people, from very famous people to authors, and so I like to get my self-help fix through those podcasts. So with that, I'm just going to take 2 seconds here and tell you a little bit about Content for Demand to give you some context. So we're a buyer-focused content strategy and content creation agency. So we really focus on helping marketers create content for every stage of the buyer's journey, as well as all of that campaign strategy and foundational components that go into a successful strategy. And as well as all of those elements that help us drive demand, whether it be promotional items such as blogs and podcasts and social and banner ads and emails and all of that stuff to support your content efforts. So today we're going to talk about, the webinar talks about auditory storytelling, and we're going to put a focus on podcasts for today. It's really a hot button. I think Steve and I talk to clients often and marketers, and it's definitely the area that I see a lot of people are experimenting with or trying to figure out how to experiment with or want to. And so we thought it would be great today to kind of dissect this format a little bit and understand where it might work in your marketing efforts as we go into the second half of the year here almost. So we're going to just kind of set the stage for what buyer-focused content is and why that's going to be more important, especially when we get into a format like podcasts. We're going to take a deep dive into podcasts, give you guys some creation best practices and some examples, and then hopefully we'll have time for some Q&A. All right. So before we dive into podcasts, I think it's important to just kind of set the stage for buyer-focused content. If any of you have sat in our webinars before, this is something Steve and I talk about a lot. With the noise and inundation with content out there that we all have, the reality is that in today's world, if we're not creating buyer-focused content, our content is not going to be seen, it's not going to get heard, and I don't care what kind of format it is, it's going to get overlooked. And so I think, our goal today is I'd like to just walk through some stats that we're seeing and kind of set the stage overall for content and the formats and what's rising to the top, just so when we talk about podcasts, we can provide some context. So I don't think this is a shock to anyone, but in Demand Gen Reports, who is wonderful enough to host this webinar series for all of us today, their new content preferences study is out, and there's some amazing stats in there, and I think just some really hard-hitting stats in terms of where content's at. So the reality is people are still consuming more or the same amount of content that they've been consuming in the past. So the need and the drive and the want for content is still there. So this is, I think one of those things we think about, but I'm hearing that we're all inundated with content, yet what we know is people are still using content to make buying decisions. And that goes back to they are. So how do I get my content seen and heard? And how do I become the piece that they are looking at in order to make that decision? And then we also are seeing that their preferences continue to evolve. So, these change year over year on this study, but I think it's interesting, 78%, I place a higher emphasis on the trustworthiness of the source. So this is fascinating, right? Because what that means is, a year ago, when this came out, or 18 months ago when we look at this, we were like, I'm looking for content that talks to my pain point. I need this content that solves X. Now I'm taking it a step further and I'm starting to look for who is it coming from. And so, this is going to play in heavily to influencer content and user-generated content. And podcasts are one of those formats when we start to talk about them that really gives you an opportunity to bring in some influencers and help get some of that content back in the forefront of what our audience is looking for. And we talk industry influencers is right behind that. And then I find myself overwhelmed about the content available is kind of in the middle there. And 50% I prefer mobile optimized content to access smartphone and tablet. So I think the main point to make here is that we have to give buyers the content they want to consume in the way that they want to consume it. So in another stat that came from this, 88% of all people surveyed want content that focuses on business value, not product specifics. This is not new, everyone. We've been talking about this for years, but I understand this is a really hard shift for a lot of organizations. And I think, though, when an organization can find a way to make the shift, the results are dramatic. We have a case study from one of our clients, Oracle, that will be at Serious Decision Summit in a few weeks, and she's going to talk about how when they shifted their product messaging in their blog and in their content strategy there, they've seen a huge uptick in their conversions. And so this is important, and when it's done right, it works. And then 75% want more data and research to support content. So just, again, yes, the data points are important, but what that speaks to is that I want content that provides value. I want content that's going to help me make a case for a change or a shift or a new purchase or whatever it is I eventually need to do, and stats play well into that. And so that leads really nicely into what kind of content formats do people prefer. And I love, this is my favorite piece of this survey every year, and because I like to see how things shift. And it doesn't change as dramatically as we'd like to see every year, I think, at least from my perspective, but I think it's about interpretation and how we do this. So case studies is number one, and I have to look back. I don't believe they were number one last year. I think white papers still was, but I'd have to double check that. But white papers is always an interesting one for me because I could probably survey you all, and I would bet many of you are not creating white papers, at least in the traditional sense anymore. So, keep this with a, just when you think about this, think this isn't the white paper that we think of, 20 pages and heavy text and no images. This is definitely a reimagination of a white paper. It often takes the format of a best practice guide or an ebook or something that's long format and that people just equate with a white paper. I think the important thing, though, that's really interesting is blog posts up there. And I'm pointing that one out because how we use blog posts in the top of the funnel and the different ways that we can approach blogging is very similar to some of the things we're going to talk about with podcasts. And so with podcasts obviously not up here yet, it's definitely one of those that we're experimenting and trying. It's got a lot of those key benefits and those things that we can do in a blog, we can do it in an auditory fashion with a podcast. And I think they work hand in hand often, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So I'm just going to skip here for a second. So we looked at content formats. We're seeing what people are looking for. We're seeing that people are still using content to drive their purchase decisions. This is interesting. So they're using content, but they're not spending as much time as I think we all would love to hope with it. I mean, 5 minutes is still a great amount of time, I think, when you're looking at a piece of content, but it's only 5 minutes. So when I look at formats and I'm making decisions about how am I going to get their attention, how do I want to spend those 5 minutes? And an auditory asset like a podcast where I can listen to it is going to get me the details really quickly, where I'm not scanning a really long ebook and I'm just hoping that they're going to grab the 5 most important things out of that ebook in the 5 minutes. So it lends itself to that. There's also a great thing we're going to talk about with podcasts later, that could I get them a little bit longer if they're listening to something, because maybe it's in the background, where a static asset, I have to be engaged. I have to look at an ebook. But, we all look at our habits for podcasts and when you might listen to them, and you're going to find that often you're doing something else while you're doing it. And so that's a lot different than static content. So we have the opportunity, I guess, to increase that with a podcast. And I actually think in a minute I have a slide that shows some of those times. So I think the thing to talk about here is just, again, reminding ourselves how we're being measured. And B2B marketers are being measured. Again, this is changing. I think it, was often about clicks and how many opens did I get, how many conversions, but we're seeing that pipeline influences is becoming more important. And actually, I see that accounts engaged is really low, but I just sat with a very large client this week who actually is shifting that perception, and they're going to start measuring on accounts engaged, because it starts to play into an account-based marketing, an account-based strategy type of play, which allows us to better measure how we're actually, as marketers, if I can say I landed these accounts and they were on my target account list, that is something really measurable. So I think we're going to see that one go up in the next 18 months. And maybe even sooner, as account-based marketing just continues to grow as a trend. So when we look at how we're being measured, what does that mean for all of our priorities for the year? It means that we're focusing on lead quality over lead quantity. And we're really going to have to pay attention to how do I drive the right kind of lead versus the most leads, right? And then, we're looking at how do I improve those conversion rates and campaign results. It continues to be, if I'm all about quality, and that means I'm getting less of them in, that conversion point becomes really more important, because maybe I was driving 1,000 leads and now I'm only focused on driving 500 and I have to convert so many. Those numbers start to go down. So my conversion rate has to go up. And how do I do that? And what does my content need to look like in order to do that? So all of this tells a story about our buyer, which is what I started at the beginning. If we do not know who our buyer is, if we haven't laid that foundation for doing our audience analysis, doing the right kind of messaging and that persona, that any of the stuff we're going to talk about, whether it's podcast or video or interactive, none of it matters, because then we're just creating random acts of content, and we're not going to be able to achieve those priorities that we all have for the year, which is driving better quality leads and having higher conversion rates. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Steve, because our goal here is to talk about a content format that we think, when done correctly, can be a great item to add to our mix of content for the year to help us achieve some of those goals.
We don't think it, Dana. We know it's a good thing to add to your strategy. And yeah, exactly. That's what we're going to talk through right now. So, I mean, really, because we've seen podcasts, it's not a new format. We've really seen it being increasing in popularity. And then ultimately what we marketers want to see, right, is its effectiveness. So let's just take a second and talk specifically about, podcasts as a format in general. Some really cool stats we found in building this webinar. Actually, this first one, 44% of the U.S. population is saying they've listened to a podcast. Dana, I don't know about you. I actually thought this would be a higher percentage.
Yeah, I think I'd be interested too. It'd be great to see like the breakdown of age, right? And see where the age group is starting to kind of to fall in there. But I think, I bet you in the next year, I'd love to see the stat next year, right? And see how much it's gone up. I think we're going to see it go up.
Co-series next year. But yeah, the reality is that 44% is a big number, right? And to Dana's point, I think it only stands to go up. What was even more exciting for me as a marketer was to look at where are they consuming it. So if you think about traditional B2B marketing tactics, where we're usually focusing in is reaching marketers or our buyers rather while they're at work, since we're B2B companies. So you can see podcasts, 11% of the folks in this survey said that they were consuming podcasts at work, which is great because that's where we're already meeting them. But it presents a larger opportunity. The other 89% of their day, they're listening to podcasts, and you can build a message platform that they can access during those times when traditionally B2B marketers haven't really had that attention. This was another couple series of good stats. So 80% listen to all or most of each podcast. So for terms of the listening stats, which I'm going to expand on earlier, Dana mentioned that buyers have sort of limited amounts of attention these days. We all know that, but this is indication here that folks are listening to on average about 7 shows per week, which is huge. That's a huge window for you to say they're watching 7 or listening rather to 7 different shows. There's a lot of opportunity for our podcast to make that list of 7 different shows they're listening to each week. But again, the more exciting thing to me as a marketer is, again, that, 80% of the folks surveyed here are saying they're listening to either the entire episode or most of the episode, which is huge. We definitely don't see those types of stats across all the different content formats out today. So let's talk a little bit. Those were so podcast stats at general, whether it's business or leisure. These are some cool stats, again, from the content preferences study that it was actually one, Dana showed it earlier, the different stats that were helpful in B2B marketers buyers making decisions. This breaks it down by buyer stage. So starting with the early stage in the light blue, there you go. Podcasts, 64% are saying this is helping them evaluate a buying process and a buying decision. So this is, I think, the first year that podcasts have been included in it, and it was really exciting to see it debut such a high. In fact, if you look at all the different formats across early, middle, and late, podcast has the third highest percentage allocation of them saying it's a useful content format in terms of informing a buying decision. And then as we look at mid-stage, we obviously love webinars. We're doing one right now. They're definitely effective. And I think it makes sense that you see them as a little bit more in the mid-stage. Oftentimes when you get buyers into sort of that solution selection stage, a little bit farther down the funnel, you might need to start adding some complexity. And webinars are a good way to sort of add visual to the auditory nature. It was also interesting to see interactive content continue to see this rise every year. But I think seeing webinars and interactive content placed so highly in the mid stage, I think opens the door to start seeing podcasts rise up a little bit more deeper in the funnel. And then lastly, the most interesting stat I noticed in the late stage formats that were most effective was really tying back to Dana's earlier point about incorporating your colleagues and peers. This stands to say that, podcasts are a great way to actually interview your colleagues at your company and position them as thought leaders. And then obviously, if you can get a couple of your customers to participate with you in a podcast, there you've got that peer influencer to help talk directly to your buyers. So really, you can see podcasts sort of woven into all 3 different layers of the buyer's journey. And this is another cool stat. So we talked about which ones were helping B2B marketers make content decisions. This is one that these are the types of content formats that they share with their colleagues. So webinars, want to just circle that one, obviously, just again, given to the auditory nature that we think, again, that sort of the same aspect applies to podcasts. But then that was really interesting to see blog posts. I don't think we've ever seen this one this high. And it goes back to some of the points that Dana made earlier. But if you think about a blog post, I mean, there's an opportunity right there. I mean, not to say that you should just read your blogs out loud and turn it into a podcast, but you're already offering something there. So why not take that into a more engaging format, conduct an interview, and turn that blog post into a podcast?
Yeah, and Steve, we're going to talk later on about a client who actually, uses podcasts to fuel the blog and blog to fuel the podcast, right? So it's kind of a great kind of 1-2 punch.
Absolutely. No, I loved how, I think across the board, and here even you can see it here, just on time spent reviewing content by format type. You can see blog posts there at the bottom, 41 and 15% are saying that they're reading and engaging with blog posts for 41 and 15% respectively. And then third-party analyst reports. I think this is, again, kind of referencing back Dana's earlier point about influencers, right? So kind of pulling yourself back from the conversation a little bit and saying, here's what third parties and outside influencers are saying about our product, our solution, our brand. You can see those resonating really high. Again, if you can get an influencer to participate in your podcast and include them as a part of the interview or the feature, it's really going to help pack more of a punch. And then even case studies, I mean, you see that consistently in a couple different slides now that we've shared. Again, I know it's always a tall order. It's never easy to get our customers to speak in a case study, but or really participate in one, but perhaps it's just because we're asking them to do it in more of a written format or a video format. Hopping on a call and recording some audio is a lot simpler and a lot better use of, and arguably, of our customers' times, and can add some really good oomph to even just a traditionally packaged case study. And then definitely would love to see, so we got podcast and webinars here on this lastly. Again, you're not seeing huge stat numbers with the podcast in the earlier stage, but definitely 16% in 5 to 10 minute range. Dana's going to talk a little bit later in the presentation about sort of what we think is the hot, or sort of the sweet spot rather, of the length of a podcast. And this correlates actually really closely with what we're seeing. And then to Dana's earlier point, white papers. I can't really wrap my head around this, except that obviously the people are spending time with them. My guess, Dana, would be that this is just due to the sheer length of a white paper, right? Mm-hmm. So then, if I haven't belabored the point enough, this is just one that, again, what are the different formats that buyers are giving most credence to? Third-party analyst reports and peer reviews and user-generated feedback, both of which are prime sort of areas of marketing to incorporate and publish and bring to the light those types of authors and speakers as a podcast. All right, so with that, I'll pass it over to Dana to talk about some actual creation tips and best practices.
Great, thanks, Steve. All right. So it's fun. I mean, for those of you who are podcast followers, it's always interesting to me. I think the stat I read is that B2B is always about 5 years behind B2C. And I think that gap is closing. With podcasts, I mean, like with any other format type or any type of content or trend that we see, it's about how do we adapt a lot of the things we're seeing in B2C and how it works and how does that come into the B2B world. And so I think, the typical format we see in the B2C world, which we're used to, is very much, it's a series, right? At the end of the day, it wraps around a series, and it may go on for so many episodes, and then may take a break, and it may come back. But at the end of the day, it's about telling a story, and sometimes that story is just an interview. So where one person is asking somebody questions, and it's a conversation, right? It's meant to feel conversational. It doesn't feel scripted. It's engaging. You want to listen to what the other person is saying. You feel that there's a connection between the two people talking. And then there's kind of the look back, right? So where there's a moderator or somebody, a storyteller telling the story. Think of the podcast Serial, right? Where she's telling the story of somebody's, journey, and then she's clipping back to different interviews and conversations that has happened that she's told the story. And this is something we can do in B2B just as well. And I'll talk about how in a little bit. And then there's just kind of a pain point. There's somebody who's just talking. about something they're experiencing. So think about if I have a blog on the 5 things I learned from my software implementation. Let's just make it that simple. And so think about then I'm just going to talk about as my experience the things I learned during that implementation and the challenges I had, and it's really real. Again, the goal is always unscripted, feeling in nature, and but I'm not talking about a product. Just keep that in mind when we talked earlier about a stat that says we don't want to hear product focus. We're talking about an experience that I went through as somebody else in my shoes might benefit from or learn from the pains that I went through. And then there's a review. A review could be, this probably is about the only one where we start to see product come in. I guess I could be doing a product review here. I could be doing a review of, a show that I attended. It could be a session I saw at a conference. It could be something I learned or a piece that I did. Depending on your industry, there's different ways that we can apply that.
Yeah, industry trends, I was going to say, would probably be a great one to sit down and just review with your customers, right? I mean, it's sort of almost has no agenda, but except to educate them, right?
Absolutely. That's a great idea, Steve. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the process for podcasts. So what I love about podcasts, and I'm really passionate about podcasts right now, because I think it's such a fun content format and a different way to think about things, but it's also so much easier to create and less expensive than a video. And we're all into videos right now, right? Videos. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago and was on a panel with a gentleman who was like, this is the year for video. And I was like, yeah, but as B2B marketers, we can all only do so much video because it's expensive and it takes a long time to create. But podcast gives me that leg up. I can make it feel auditory. I can make it feel like it's got that same kind of feel as a video. I get you of the visual, but I can give it, some of those same elements without having that cost and time commitment. So a podcast, as an upfront, what we do with our clients and what we tell our clients to do is like any other marketing tactic or campaign that you're running, there needs to be a strategy. So you need to put behind it. It should be a series. It should be 7 or 8. If I'm trying this out, do 5 of them. Do a series and put a name to the series and make sure you know what's the goal or the focus of the series going to be and lay that out and then give yourself some targets. If I'm going to do 5 or 8 or 10, what might that progression of topics be like? And how do they all kind of fit together? So make sure it feels cohesive. What this allows you to do, A, it allows you to pilot this. And then B, it allows you to give something to grow on. So if I give this a series name and the focus for this series or segment of series is X, next time I can take a break, I can come back to it and I can shift to that a little bit and it'll make sense. The other thing I think everyone needs to keep in mind here is that it's really important to be consistent with these. So by committing to just a few, if this format doesn't work, you've been able to be consistent. So you haven't turned anybody off because, at the end of the day, random acts of content we want to stay away from no matter what format we're at. So podcasts are especially true. Doing a one-off podcast serves nobody. It's going to be weird. It's going to be odd. How does it get used? It just doesn't make logical sense because of the nature of the format and how we consume podcasts as an audience. We're going to be looking for more. So it's okay to set it small and give yourself some pilot time and get that going. But just keep that in mind that consistency is important, and 1 or 2 here it's not going to give you a really good sense for how these perform. So brainstorm your concepts, get all of your strategy complete, and then work to identify your speakers. The easiest way to do podcasts is the interview right now, or one of the other ones where it's just you or someone from your organization speaking. The one where you're weaving in multiple interviews and stuff, that is fantastic, but that's a much more advanced way of doing it. And you've got to, then you're basically doing a storyboard like a video and you're watching clips of things and you're making sure that you get or listening to clips of, interviews and cutting. And so it's a more complex. If you want to make this really easy, pick someone from your company, find some influencers, interview them, do partners, channel partners, customers, and find somebody who has that radio type voice, who's really energetic, somebody who's passionate, who speaks, just someone who's got, a passion for podcasts and wants to talk, and have them be the moderator and interview the person. And I'll talk about how that works. Or if you're just going to pick somebody from your company to do a review or a trend update or some of those other items, get those speakers aligned. So how we do this and how this works is, you want good recording equipment. And the great thing about podcasts is we're all remote, doesn't matter. Everybody can be in their office. We just need quiet. Most computer mics work okay. If somebody has a microphone, even better. But we're doing a lot of them for our clients with just the mic on our computers. And how we're doing it is we're all getting on a conference call. So a WebEx, a Skype, whatever your go-to meeting, whatever your meeting platform of choice is. We are recording through that device, but that is not the recording you want to use for your podcast. We ask everybody who is speaking on the podcast to download Audacity. It's a free software. I believe it's free, and everybody downloads it. And what it's going to do is it's going to record a native file on your computer for you. So it's just picking up your computer or in your office, so it's important to be quiet. And then everybody is talking in those different, on the recordings. We've got a master recording via the meeting platform, so that way we know the flow of the questions. And then when everybody's done recording, they're going to send in their files to us, and we collect all the native files of the speaking. So what's great now is we have a really clear audio file from everybody who's speaking on the webinar, but I've got this master transcript that we recorded on our meeting platform that's going to help drive our next phase of the production. So for us, the next thing is to kind of review and remap before this goes into production. So let's say that I was interviewing my podcast talent, and in there, we went through the questions, but I decided that one question doesn't really fit with the flow of the conversation, so I want to pull it out. Or, hey, I want to bump up question 5 to the top because what he said there was way more interesting than what I started with question 1. And so what we'll do internally is we take that master transcript and we start to remap and reorganize that podcast into the order we want. So we're essentially creating a video storyboard. And then we go ahead and we send that to audio production. They go ahead and they audit it. They add some great music to the front end and the back end and give it our series intro. And we go ahead and our clients can publish it to whichever platforms they're using. And there are many places you can host podcasts these days. So you can put them in a lot of places. There's SoundHound. I believe you can do it on iTunes. There's literally a list of like 30 or 40 of them that you can put them. So there's lots of places to put these and host these and get your traction and where you want to drive your listeners to. All right. So that was a mouthful there. I apologize in terms of everything that you can do. So next step is just, what are some of those best practices? So length is important here. We're B2B, and attention spans are short. I don't know about you guys. Even an hour podcast for me gets a little long. If I'm listening to a story like Serial, it can keep me going. But if I'm listening to one of my self-help favorite podcasts, after about 30 minutes, I'm kind of done. And we're seeing that as kind of the benchmark is, 30 minutes and under is really ideal. Some of our clients are experimenting with breaking them up into 5-minute pieces and releasing a chunk every day. I think that works in social promotion. It's great. But I think what we have to remember is people want to hear a continuous story. We don't want to chop the story up too much. So, anything between that 15 and 30 minutes is going to give you a really nice story.
Unless you're producing the Serial of B2B podcasts, right? Then you can keep it 60 minutes.
Yes. If you think you've got the idea that's going to push you over the edge and make you as popular as Serial, then yes. And then I do want to say with all content, quality matters most. So, I mean, if if your podcast is 40 minutes because you have 2 questions that you think are just like the most amazing answer you got from there, and you're going, this thing is really cohesive together, then leave it together, right? And just know you might have some fall off towards the end. So prioritize and remap that podcast to get the things that you think are really important and you want people to drive home from it. Okay, so then podcast metrics that matter. I think, Steve, do you want to take this one and talk through a little about this?
Yeah, no problem. I mean, I know Dana and I've had a lot of conversations with clients about, hey, what should we be looking at in terms of gauging podcast success? And I think a lot of the platforms aren't necessarily as turnkey in terms of, an output or a measurement, but there are definitely ways that you can add tracking to the different assets that you're hosting. And again, in this case, they're just going to be podcast files. So 3 key things that we typically talk to our clients about in terms of tracking is who's listening to your podcast, and then if you can get to it, how long they listen. That's obviously a huge indicator of how engaged they are. And then even beyond how long, if they're coming back and re-listening, or if you can somehow track the sharing of the podcast, that's definitely an indication of an engaged buyer, someone that you should be following up with. And then lastly, I think the actions that they take after listening, it's a big sort of homage to that you never end a content piece with a dead end. Always give them a rabbit hole, sort of recommended the next step. You can do that literally by saying it at the end of your podcast if there's something you want to direct them to, and then try to correlate and connect the dots of saying, okay, who downloaded my podcast, who listened to it, who accessed it from my landing page, whatever I might be able to track, and then did they go and also take the necessary recommended action, whether it was one that I mentioned on air or that I actually directed to them to on the landing page or the source information that's included on the platform that you're hosting your podcast files from. Anything you would add to that, Dana?
Yeah, I think the only other thing I would add is this is the perfect tool for the subscription, right? Like sign up to be notified when the next podcast comes out. What we know about podcasts is people become really loyal. We're going to talk about consistency coming up and why that is so important with podcast series. And so I think this is the thing people actually do want to subscribe to if they like your podcast series, because they actually want to know, they want to be notified when the next podcast is coming out. Great. So we're moving on then to podcast best practices, do's and don'ts. So let's start with the don'ts. Random acts of podcasting, which I mentioned before. We definitely do not want to be just creating one-off podcasts. Just doesn't work. It's not, it just doesn't fit in the strategy. Podcasts are the things people crave to hear more of. If you guys are consistent, Steve, I know you mentioned you really, listen to your podcast on a general basis. I look for mine. I look consistently for when that next issue or that next series or that next episode is coming out. So making sure that you are consistent with them. And, what we say is that if you're going to come out on the third Thursday of every month at 5 p.m. Eastern, you need to come out at Thursdays at 5 p.m. Eastern with your podcast. So also be careful what you commit to. If you're not willing to do weekly yet or biweekly and you're just doing monthly, that's all okay. Just make sure whatever you commit to do, you actually follow through with. And then information or complexity overload. Again, this is not a webinar. This isn't a video. People can't see anything. So as soon as I start to take a deep dive into a technical issue where visuals may actually support it, it's probably not podcast fodder. So just keep that in mind in terms of what belongs in a podcast and what belongs in my videos or in my webinars or in my static content. It tends to be top of the funnel, thought leadership conversations and stories, right? This is really the key idea is how do I catch you? I catch you with a story and tell that story. Demos, things like that, probably not the place for podcasts. And then we say, don't be afraid to fail. This is one of those you could totally experiment with and have a good time. I mean, if you guys go on Spotify or any of these places and look at the podcast, so many different ones out there. So try something fun, try something different. This is a great avenue to be really creative. This is one of those you can have fun with and don't have to feel so corporate, or, doesn't have to, we're not worried about brand colors in here. I mean, this is the one where we can have some fun. And so we really encourage people to be creative with your series topics and how you're going to approach things and test the waters a little bit.
We should probably put in, don't be afraid to fail too. I mean, just the fact that you might not have 1 million subscribers after your first episode, that you've got to kind of keep at it and test out what works.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that this is, we always say lather, rinse, repeat, in terms of how you're doing it. So, keep trying it and then find what works and then keep growing it from there. And it's not, I mean, everything doesn't work the first time, right? We all know that. And this is one that I think you have some leeway to try and fail a little bit. Okay, so our do's. Consistency is key. I said it. Pick the date, stick by it. Pick the amount that we're doing, and try it, commit to it, and stick to it. Align those podcasts with buyer-focused pain points. So remember how we talked about knowing our buyer way back at the front of this webinar? This is really important. This is no different than any of our other content formats. We have to go back to the pain points and who our buyers are and what they need to hear, and make sure we align the stories that we're going to tell to them. We talked about telling stories, and then find ways to repurpose these. We're going to show you some samples about how these can be embedded in blogs, in infographics, and just clips of them, right? It doesn't have to be the full podcast. How can we make this part of a more integrated campaign that leverages influencers and podcasts and in an ebook and in social, and take it across the board. So don't think that this is just, a series here and it has to live by itself and it never gets used again. So that is great. Identify your internal guests. I think we sometimes forget that we all have these amazing people in our organizations who, maybe it's the engineer sits way down the hall or in a different office who's really passionate about something. And when you get them speaking about something like that, maybe they can't write a white paper, they're not helping you there, but they're great to talk to. And so look for those internal people that you can leverage. And then incorporate outside influencers. I mean, this is something we should all be thinking about across our content strategies. Podcasts are a great format for that. The other thing that we don't have on here that I just want to point out that kind of came to me as I was speaking is our internal podcast guru, Devin, is always saying that when we first come out with a podcast series, you should have a few already loaded in there. So don't come out with the first one and have nothing else there. I mean, I know we keep talking about Netflix binging experience. Podcasts are one of those formats that people tend to binge. So when you find a new podcast series you're into, you tend to go, oh, I really like that. What else is here? And they might just jump in and listen to the next 2 or 3. So have a back, go to market with 3 or 4. You can still serve up your first one like it's the first one, but what you want to do is have 3 or 4 sitting in the page that you're using wherever you're hosting it, so that if somebody is ready to dig in now and go, they're all there for them. So that's one that we missed on the slide.
Oh, good ad there.
All right,
awesome.
Steve, take us into some samples.
Let's see if we can do this. Dana's going to be manning the slides. I'm going to enable screen share for everyone.
We'll see if
Dana,
technology cooperates.
Exactly. That's always a big one. So, Dana, why don't you let me know once you can see the actual client sample.
Sounds great. All right, we are up. All right.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to walk through a couple, and then we'll pass it over to Dana. But to help you crystallize everything, we wanted to actually show you some actual executions of podcasts, either as a standalone asset or as a way that they've been incorporated. One that is actually from one of our clients called Cox Media. They sell local advertising to small and medium-sized businesses. They sell mostly TV advertising, but they also sell mobile phone advertising. So they wanted to create an infographic that talked about just how addicted society has become to their phones, how they're using them. So we helped them create an interactive infographic that helps, it's a little more interactive. Things are happening as you scroll through it versus sort of a traditional static infographic. We could load in things like to-dos. But one thing that Cox Media and Content for Demand, we decided is that we actually could add a lot of clout to this by including an outside influencers. So what did we do? We went out and figured out who are some mobile advertising mavens out in the industry, and we interviewed them. And then what was really cool is we were able to sort of record really lengthy sessions, but then peel it down to about 5 to 10-minute segments, or even 2-minute segments, I think. And they actually were embedded here in the interactive infographics so that they could be adding to the stats and the conversation that's being presented in the content piece. One other thing I like to mention is that Dana talked about identifying your internal influencers. So not only did we find 2 outside influencers to incorporate into just this piece, but then we actually interviewed Cox Media's product marketing manager for mobile, their mobile platform, and had her speak as well, positioning her as, again, a Cox Media employee. It was very clear, but then she's positioned alongside these sort of SMEs and influencers, so it really added a lot more credibility and clout, and then positioned Cox Media also as an authoritarian in the area. So the next one I wanted to share is actually some our own marketing strategy. So we talk to clients a lot about creating content. That's a huge part of what we do here at the agency. One of the things we talk about is creating modular content that can be broken out into larger pieces. So we wanted to sort of drink our own champagne, and in building this piece, we created an ebook. Then we got to a section where we're talking about different things that you could do to make your content more meaty from the get-go, and then how it could be repurposed. Separately from that, we had also done a webinar that was all about ways of repurposing content and being more modular in your approach to content. And so we actually just stole a little snippet of the audio recording from that webinar. I should say stole, we repurposed it, and then embedded it right here in the piece. So it plays just, I think, a 60-second clip of that amazing webinar. If I'm actually, one thing that we could probably have done better here is then added another call to action from this interactive piece that said, hey, did you like what you heard? Click here to actually access the entire webinar. And then that way we're getting more leverage out of just the tiny little podcast snippet that's directing them to a part of our piece that's making it more engaging, but then also directing them to the meatier webinar.
One thing I'll add here, Steve, is this, you know how you talked about back that you can do like weaving in multiple interviews. So one of the things I didn't mention is you can pull audio from webinars and videos. So like if I've got a moderator telling a story and I'm going to do these cut-ins, so similar to what we're doing here where we're kind of cutting into static content, where we can cut these pieces in to an actual podcast. So the video or the audio can be lifted from webinars and it can be lifted from videos. Now, there are some restrictions there, so I don't want to say a blanket statement, but do think about what you already have in your webinar library or what your video library that you could kind of repurpose into a podcast and just maybe lift some of your audio out of it. So this is a really good example of that.
Love it. All right, Dana, take it away.
Okay, so this next one that I'm going to talk about is a really robust campaign, and I would say it was driven by influencers, and podcasts are just a component of it, right? So, but what I want to show you, because it's integrated so well, this client who is doing this started a marketing or a podcast series, and it's actually for marketers, and they started this podcast series, but we identified influencers that were going to be used in a series of content, one of which is podcasts, one of which is blogs, and then some actual content that supports it. And so what we did, we really tried to leverage our influencers' time and make sure that we were getting as much out of that. So one of the things that we did, which was really kind of cool, I think, in these podcasts, is we asked the influencers a bunch of questions. Some of those questions were reserved for the blog. Some of them were reserved for the podcast. So after the interview, we would slice and dice it and go, okay, these 3 questions are going to appear in the blog only. These are going to appear in the podcast, and then we're going to cross-promote them via the podcast and the blog. So the great thing is I could go, hey, I want to learn more, go check out our blog and see how so-and-so answered this, or I could say here, go here, and I could go ahead and listen to some more information from Influencer X. So it's a really great way. They piloted this and have seen a lot of success with it. So it's a great way to think about ways to kind of use podcasts in multiple ways than just the podcast format, and to use our influencers and make sure that when I got an influencer, I'm really leveraging them as much as I can. Okay, so then the next thing is just then this client has done a fantastic job promoting then the podcast. So through social and highlighting the influencers and saying it's a podcast. And there was a pretty robust media campaign behind this. And I know that they've seen a lot of success in LinkedIn, actually, in terms of promoting podcasts. So the audience in LinkedIn seems to be, and with our LinkedIn still, I know, is continuing to prove a really valuable social outlet for B2B, is podcast is a great way, or LinkedIn is a great way to help drive the podcast. And then just to kind of bring it home, it has been embedded in a lot of the content. So this is actually an interactive asset. I kind of call it an iPaper or a landing page or a hub for the campaign. And within this hub and all this other content, we've also, promoted the podcast series as a big piece of this landing page and hub. So it's all cross-promoted, and it's really well integrated into lots of formats. And then again, as Steve showed us with the Cox Media example early on, we can often take even the pieces of this podcast next piece, and those could go back and be embedded in other pieces of content for the campaign. So, the great thing, like I said early on, about remapping that and having that master transcript is, do some pre-planning and tag some of those quotes that you think are important, that go, oh, that quote would be great back in my ebook where we talked about X, and can be embedded in the sidebar. So lots of cool things that we can do in terms of then clipping these up into smaller pieces. And I think we're running out of time. So with that, Steve,
all right, let's get back to the presentation.
Yeah.
You bet. Hang on. Stop the sharing. Okay. Do you want to hit the takeaways, or should I?
No, go right ahead, Steve. Why don't you close it down?
All right, yeah. So we covered a lot, and we want to thank you guys all for being a part of it and sticking with us. This is obviously a topic that we love, and we have lots to say about. So we thought we'd just distill it into 4 different sort of top takeaways for you guys. We talked a lot about being buyer focused. And again, it's really to help guide you. If you're thinking about taking on podcasts, make sure that you're going to be talking about the themes and topics that are most relevant for your buyers. It's going to give you the best chance of success, not only for your podcast, but even for any and all content you create for your audience. And then we talked about just, be brave, experiment with what you think works. If that doesn't get you a lot of subscriptions or not seeing it really take off, it's probably not a topic worth keeping going with. So keep trying and don't give up early. And then we showed a lot of good examples about just how you can get more mileage out of your podcast. I mean, definitely want to create your own sort of ongoing presence, a weekly or monthly series that you're producing, but then make the most of those podcasts, snip them apart and embed them all over the place. It's only going to add to the engagement of your overall content. And then lastly, don't think you have to do it all yourself. I mean, we all saw on Dana's process slide, it's not, I mean, we laid it out nicely, and by all means, we encourage you to go tackle it and produce your own podcast. But there's a reason why agencies like ours exist. We're here to help you not only just understand what the best practices are and avoid the pitfalls, but also to help you become extension of your marketing team and get these kinds of really cool and robust content formats. So, and of course, Dana and I like to talk about podcasts. So if you have any questions, definitely reach outside for help where you need it, and we're here for you. With that, I think we'll take it over to Sal for questions. If we've got any time.
Thank you, Steve and Dana. Great presentation. Really appreciate it. Obviously, some great examples, some great advice, which of course leads to great questions. But before I get to those questions, I am contractually obligated to remind everyone to please share your thoughts and feedback before logging off. You can either do it by clicking on the survey icon, which is the survey icon, which I've circled at the bottom of your screen, or of course the survey will automatically launch once the session ends. So I know we are short on time, so we're going to try to get to a couple of these. You had some great ones. I picked them out as you were going. So let's get to those questions now. The first question, I guess, Dana, we'll have you start off, comes from Ryan. He's asking, can you share some go-to sources of inspiration for your different podcast types?
Yeah, so I think that I know I've said this ad nauseum today, but I really look to my personas and our buyers for kind of inspiration, like in what's that, creative topics. and what are those pain points. We use some tools, and not just for podcasts, but across the board as an agency. We use BuzzSumo for helping us find kind of what topics are trending for our different clients. And so that's a really good source for us when we're looking at topics too, is especially because we can align, we know who our buyers are and who's going. And so then when I start to look up influencers and themes and or topics, sometimes there's some great things that bubble up to the top. And then this is where I say, like, really get out of the box too, is you know where your buyers' pain points are, but what's like kind of a creative way to kind of just drive that or present it. And you know, pop culture, I think, provides us a lot of fun kind of creative things and play off some of that. And, you know, so we'll look at what's kind of trending just overall in the B2C world, and how can we kind of, you know, just massage that to fit our B2B experience. So.
Yeah, newsjacking for sure, in one word, absolutely.
Yes.
Focus on what's going on out there and relate it to your buyers.
Great. Great ideas. Actually, I went to high school with a guy named Buzz Sumo. True story. I'm only kidding.
That's got to be a fun.
Yeah, right? All right, so I got another question from Laura. She asks, is there a rule of thumb for how much you should feature company insiders versus outside guests / influencers?
Well, I don't think there's a rule of thumb. The reality is this is much easier to get our insiders than the outsiders, so that's just the reality. But I think it's not necessarily about how many should be this and how many should be that. It's really about the quality of the conversation and the information we're presenting. So, I mean, it's always better to have outside influencers, right? I mean, we're just seeing that as it comes. But when we're just starting out, I think it's totally okay to tap our internal resources. I don't know, Steve, what do you think?
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, probably maybe if you can lean a little bit heavier on the outside, but the reality, the must do is that you're mixing it up, right? Keeping the audience engaged by including not just the folks who work with you, but then those people from outside your organization where you can find them, whether they're influencers or customers.
Yep.
Right. So a good, healthy mix, to say the least. So, all right, and I think we have time for one more question. This one from Aaron, or as you know, Key and Peele fans would say, Aaron. He asked, are there guidelines for when audio alone will get the job done versus when you need visuals, formats like video or a webinar?
Yeah, I think it's really about the complexity of the conversation you're having. I think of podcasts as I know I keep saying storytelling, but it's like I'm having a conversation with somebody, or I'm telling a story that I can just convey without a visual, right? And so that means, like, it's not complex. I can talk, like, just like we're talking, you know, today through this, you know, outside of the samples, Steve and I probably could have talked about most of what we did today via a podcast. I don't think, you know, outside of the samples, which I think are important to seeing and or hearing in this case, you know, I think that this topic is pretty high level enough that we probably could have handled via podcast. But if I was actually, you know, doing a demonstration on how to use On24 today, that probably wouldn't have been so great on a podcast. Steve, anything you'd add?
No, I think you said it ultimately ties back to complexity. And then is your conversation going to be better? You're going to get your point across better, including a visual. I mean, we love podcasts, but there's definitely a reason why video and webinars also have their place in the content mix.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Again, I think a good, healthy mix. So, well, unfortunately, we are at the top of the hour. So, again, I do appreciate Dana and Steve all the insights you've provided us. I apologize to everyone who has the questions they submitted, but we didn't get to. I know we'll have Dana and Steve follow up with you folks directly after the webcast. So, again, I want to thank Dana and Steve again, Content for Demand, for a great session. I also want to thank all of you for taking the time out today to join us. As a final reminder that today's webinar will be available on demand, so don't worry, you can access it at any time and, of course, share it with your peers and colleagues. And, again, I want to thank folks for attending. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend. Bye-bye, everybody.